So let's hear from Cody from Texas. Cody, you are on Talk Heathen. Welcome.
Well, hello. Hi, Lloyd. Hi, Kenneth.
How you doing?
Lloyd, I'm a huge fan of yours. Very grateful for your work. My wife and I just woke up from Jehovah's Witnesses in December of 2020. Can't thank you enough for all your content. Really was instrumental in that, and of course the book Crisis of Conscience. But
thank you.
No, thank you.
And congratulations on waking up. That's fantastic.
Thank you. That's we've now celebrated each one of my 3 kids' birthdays for the first time, age 4, 7, and 10. So it's been a exciting 7, 8 months, I guess, 9 months.
And it's such a harmless thing, isn't it, to celebrate a kid's birthday? You know, you wonder why you weren't doing it before. It just brings nothing but joy and positivity, and yet that's somehow evil to Jehovah's Witnesses. But there we go.
You know, when we left, I kind of went through, you know, I heard in some of your videos that a lot of times there's a process or there's a progression of your beliefs. And you start out, many of us that leave a so-called sect of Christianity or cult of Christianity, and you realize that the organization Jehovah's Witnesses in particular is wrong. But for me, you know, my mind still struggled with, well, you know, they're just doing it wrong. The Bible's still it. That this is still the guidebook for us humans. And now I've continued in my research and learning and just finding all the inconsistencies with the Bible itself, how it contradicts itself. And now I'm to the point, I don't know what to believe, but surely God cannot be what the Bible says he is where I'm at. My wife and I were just having this discussion last night. She's still much more Christian-y, I would call her, than I am. But the biggest thing I have struggled with is coming to that conclusion or that consideration of the possibility that the Bible is all nonsense. Struggling with throughout my whole life, 34 years, this whole life was just a dress rehearsal. And I was just looking forward to paradise. So anything that was messed up or going wrong now didn't really matter because I have paradise to look forward to. Now that I don't, I really struggle with my own mortality. Do you guys have any advice or tips on how to get through that struggle of coming to terms with that?
Yeah, mortality in particular is a tough one. And really, when you think about it, the very fact that this is kind of like almost front center in the stuff that we have to kind of unpack when we're considering ditching religion kind of tells you how we arrived at religion in the first place. You know, we don't like the idea of dying, do we? And, you know, you'll have experienced this as a father yourself. You know, it's hard talking to kids about death. I'm sorry, it just is. And, you know, when I was in the Jehovah's Witness religion, you know, you just have this convenient answer on a plate of, well, we don't really die. We're resurrected in a paradise earth. Or if you're part of this elite number of 144,000, you go to heaven. You don't have to confront your mortality, essentially, so that when someone you care about dies, hey, no big deal, because I'm going to see my Aunt Nora in the future, in the paradise. And you're basically living in denial. And actually, when you have conversations with your kids and they're saying, well, what happens when we die? It would be so much easier. And I'm saying this now as an atheist. It would be so much easier and so much more convenient to say, hey, honey, we go to heaven. You know, job done. There's that difficult conversation out of the way. But what you actually have to do when you're atheist and you're trying to raise your child honestly is to say, well, as far as we know, we have an amount of time on our planet, and when we die, we die. But that just makes our life more precious and our time together more important, so that we need to enjoy our time with each other and be as kind and loving to each other as possible, so that we can make our time on this planet count. And it's a challenge, even when you say that, even when you come up with all sorts of creative ways of getting it across, in a child's mind, it's very difficult. And when you're getting out, even if you're not a child, if you're getting out of that way of thinking, that you don't have to worry about death, you can just kick this particular problem into the long grass, it can be a very unsettling thing. But the more I've kind of contemplated this issue, and we talked about mortality earlier on in the show, when something has an end, it makes that thing more meaningful. If it's never going to have an end, and you don't need to worry about when something's going to end, the actual thing itself loses a bit of its value. The fact that life is punctuated by death makes every minute on our planet count, and makes it more important that we maximize our time and build and cherish our relationships, and try to leave a positive, meaningful mark on our universe. Try and leave our universe a little bit better than we found it. And so, yes, mortality becomes more of an issue, and it can be really difficult to get your head around. But the more you contemplate how lucky we are to be just to be alive, and the fact that there's nothing wrong in just enjoying life for once, like you mentioned, celebrating the birthdays of your children for the first time. Suddenly it doesn't have to be just about cheating deaths. Suddenly it can be about enjoying living.
Right. One thing my wife brought up, and I'm still struggling with the mortality thing. Like you said, it's going your entire life thinking you knew what happened after we died, to going to now of, now I'm pretty sure I know what happens, which is you just die, which is nothing, with no resurrection or afterlife or whatever. It's an unsettling, definitely an unsettling feeling. One thing I didn't know how to respond to my wife last night was she brought up, I was telling her that I was leaning pretty hard towards atheist thinking. She was brought up, well, how do you know that there's no God, or that there's no creator? Science is wrong all the time. Theories are thrown out that years later are debunked. So how do you know? I didn't quite know a good way to respond to that, because there is merit to that science does evolve and change, and obviously science at one point thought the earth was flat. I guess there are still people that think that, but I didn't know what the best way to respond to that argument was. Her point was basically, what if the Jehovah's Witnesses are right? How do we know?
So this is interesting. This was a question that has been on my mind all week, because I've been talking to people about exactly this idea of, well, how do you prove that there's no God?
Right.
So I want to introduce something to you. You may have heard of this before. So have you ever heard of Bertrand Russell?
I have not.
Oh, you're in for a treat. Okay, so check out Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell had this analogy about a teapot. He talked about how, hypothetically, there could be a teapot orbiting the Earth somewhere. And through using our telescopes, we may never be able to fix our eyes on the right spot in the sky to see it. We, could send up satellites and just miss it. We can't prove necessarily that the teapot isn't there. But when is it time to believe such a claim? If someone was to come to you and say there is a teapot orbiting the Earth, what would you need to believe that it was true?
Right.
I'm really asking you. Yeah, like what would it take for you to believe that there was a teapot orbiting the Earth? And if you think about it, the answer is probably a very simple one.
I'd have to see the spout, perhaps, or some tiny portion of it, or see some. Yeah, I have to see part of it.
Yeah, just you may agree with me. I think most of us would just need evidence. We would need evidence that the claim was true.
Right.
So the burden of proof for the person who's saying that teapot is up there is on them. It's not your job to spend the rest of your life scanning the skies to disprove that the teapot's there. It's on them to show that it is.
Right.
And that is precisely the position that you'll find most atheists are in. Most of the atheists that you encounter are not going to affirmatively say, I know for a fact that there's no such thing as a God.
Right.
For one thing, most God concepts are pretty poorly defined. The problem is that there's not good evidence for the God claims that are out there. So until such time that those claims are demonstrated to be true, until the evidence is presented, the reasonable position would be to not believe, in precisely the same way that it wouldn't be reasonable to believe that the teapot is up there.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. That's
credit goes to Bertrand Russell. I'm just with what he did.
There's a whole lot of really clever kind of thinkers out there who've explained this sort of every which way, and ultimately, I think it's important as well to distinguish between kind of deist propositions and theist propositions. Mm-hmm. So quite often we'll have callers on the show who are using philosophy to argue for just the existence of a creator. Well, that kind of gets you to deism, which is just an intelligent being creating things and just not really caring what happens. And I'm not really all that interested in disproving that, because deism has no bearing whatsoever on my life. It's only when we get to theism and religion specifically that people seem to want to control people. Have you noticed? It's never just about proving whether God exists or not. It's about pushing a specific set of dogmas. And I think when you get to these specific kind of teachings that are just openly preposterous, I don't think it's even a case of, oh, well, who knows, maybe this could be true. I mean, let's think, you said before that your wife said, what if Jehovah's Witnesses are right? Well, they believe that any moment now there's going to be a global Armageddon where everyone who's not a Jehovah's Witness, including me, including Kenneth, including you, and everyone's children all children of non-Jehovah's Witnesses, in other words, nearly 8 billion people are all going to be killed, so that there are just, let's say, 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses surviving. And then over a period of 1,000 years, 100 billion people who have ever lived are going to be resurrected onto the planet. And after all of the bodies have been buried or done away with, of all of the people who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses. And this 1,000-year kingdom is going to be ruled over by 144,000, including 8 dudes in New York who include Tony Morris and Stephen Lett, because Tony Morris and Stephen Lett and the rest of the governing body are apparently among the wisest people who have ever lived on our planet.
Well, they leave the distilleries, so Tony can get his whiskey.
Exactly. But these are openly preposterous positions. It's like when we delve into the teachings about Noah's flood and we find out that it, scientifically it couldn't have happened. And then when you have to fall back on, oh yeah, well, it's just about having faith, which you have to do as a theist, you have to do as a religious person. Well, then you can say, well, if it's just about having faith, you may as well take your pick of any religion, because they're all making outlandish claims. And if your get out of jail card is, oh, well, I'm just going to have some faith. Well, why don't you have faith in Mormons? Why don't you have faith in Hindus? Why don't you have faith in pagan religions? So, you know, a lot of this stuff is just needs to be thought about, quite frankly. But Kenneth is on the right track there. You know, there's some really brilliant thinkers who've expressed these ideas in really eloquent ways, and sometimes it's just about exposing yourself to new ideas and new ways of thinking, because ultimately it's tempting to just fall back on the programming that we were fed when we were inside these cults.
Yeah.
And that whole question of, well, what if Jehovah's Witnesses are right? That's classic. That's classic gaslighting, isn't it? That's just the sort of manipulation that we were used to when we were inside.
And that's the beautiful thing about having broken free from a high control group like that, is that, and I told my wife at the end of the conversation, I reserve the right to change my mind. That's about anything we've talked about. Because if new evidence comes to light that I find convincing, that's the beautiful thing of not being a part of this religious indoctrination, that I can evaluate the evidence and decide that maybe I was wrong in this area, maybe I was wrong in that area, and change my beliefs if there's evidence.
Yeah, and what I'd like to address, this speaks specifically to what you had said that your wife had said about science and how science is constantly changing. I happened to have been listening just this morning to a video where Neil deGrasse Tyson was talking about the idea that science is always changing. And yeah, what we tend to see in the news and in the media with regards to science is what's happening on the frontiers of science, where there is sort of constantly new research and new information being done. So if you're operating on the frontiers of science and looking just there, then yeah, things seem to be constantly changing. But if you sort of take a few steps back, there's a lot of science that is not really changing. So that's a quick, just a flag I wanted to plant. But I wanted to talk about how what you were just saying about reserving the right to change your mind points to the difference between what is on offer with scientific skepticism compared to religion. Religion offers you certainty, okay? And you can use faith to be very, very certain about things, and people do. People are certain about mutually exclusive faith-based claims that can't all be true. They could all be wrong, though. On the other hand, skepticism offers you a path to knowledge, where you can try your best to arrive at something like justified true beliefs, okay? And those are subject to revision. And that's what makes them really valuable. We tend to overvalue certainty. Certainty feels really, really safe to us. But it has certainty and faith are not paths to truth. And that is an important thing to recognize. If what you care about is whether or not your beliefs are true, then reserving the right to change your mind and evaluating the evidence are great tools.
I love, just to your point, I love the saying. I was telling my wife that I would rather have questions that I can't answer than have answers that I can't question. And that, to me, sums up our experience with Jehovah's Witnesses. Was that,
Amen.
You have an answer for everything, but what happens the first time you openly question one of those things?
I think it's just a perfectly reasonable position to take, of saying, you know what, if you want me to believe something, show me the evidence. You know, how can anyone who cares about what's true find anything objectionable in taking that position? You know?
Right. And I told her, you know, the only reason we're even considering that the Bible might be correct is because we were born in the United States, in the Bible Belt, to very religious parents that were part of a high control group.
Isn't that funny? How the greatest predictor of what a person's religious beliefs are geography and what their parents believe? Isn't that wild?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. we wouldn't even consider it in our wildest dreams that the Bible was correct if we were born in India to Hindu parents. No way.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
Well, I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for calling in, Cody, and congratulations on forging a life of freedom for you and your family. It sounds like there's still a lot of there's still a journey ahead, but it sounds like you're well on the right path. And sending out love rings to you and your family now. Can you feel those love rings pulsating, Cody? Maybe Cody's no longer
We may have to
there.
change the vibratory settings on the love rings.